different things in it. Okay, so I got the acknowledgement from it. So I would like to acknowledge the Berigal people and that are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past, present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. Thank you everyone for term 2 and for coming back to the term 2 seminar series. So we had the first term pretty much like on the go. So this term we already have like finalized all the speakers. So we are fully booked for term 2 for the seminar series this time. And it's going to run like just like last time, like every 2 weeks. And so there are like few weeks we have adjusted. So we'll have one speaker and we have like a couple of guest speakers as well this term. And otherwise it will be like two talks, like 20 minutes each. So to start with, like today we have Hoon and Rupa. So Hoon's, as I said, professor with us, and like he has been working with us in the Value Australia project as well. So today he's going to talk about mobility and COVID in India. I think the work he did with sub-based work was here with us before. And over to you, Hoon.
Thank you. Is it okay? I just sit down and it's sort of nice environment. We can discuss further. And thanks for coming this frigid day. You know, there is snows and windy and there is extreme weather. And thanks everyone coming here. I mean, this study we actually began mid last year actually. So it's a bit of for a while. Sabaswa is my former PhD student who are in India, and he sort of proposed ideas that there is some mobility data. So very, very interesting data. And he knows that daily COVID incident, which is we all know, pretty much is open data. So we try to understand if there is any correlations between their mobilities, is particular, you know, the purpose, the travel or particular location, what are the relationship or between these mobilities and COVID incident. So that's the sort of starting point. And later, early this year, you probably hear about that this devastating this COVID case in India. Sympathies goes to India worldwide, and we see that the number of COVID incident, I just showed the Australia, United States, and Brazil, and India. And we know that Brazil is kind of a steady increase over time. And also United Kingdom is actually has is sort of a sharp hike, then remain stable, but always is a high coronavirus incidence. But if you look at India, then was about just 2 months time, this number of cases doubled. So you see that 15 million to now is close to 30 million. It's much higher than entire Australia population. So this is a sharp increase. Then we actually are looking at this devastating situations, is lack of the hospital resources, and you know, the human resources. That is kind of front yard of the hospital. You see that they basically are drawing scale, and this is kind of patient isolation. So they don't have a number of hospital beds to actually solve this increasing number of patients. So this is a kind of worldwide issue. Then why is human mobility a matter? I mean, can we have a lockdown or strict social distance policy? What are the actually major cause of drivers of the coronavirus? And then, we start looking at some distance communication kind of theory. So you probably see that when you talk with someone, and you might have some kind of comfortable distance. For example, Hayden and I, maybe 2 meters. And if I talk to my family, maybe much closer, 1 meter's distance. And this is kind of, we call this socially acceptable with the distance between people. In India, it's much closer than any other in the world. So I visited India 2 years ago, and I just travel around. They don't really mind them touchings and sort of, if you hit the shoulder to shoulder, you straight away we say sorry. But they don't seem scared. Okay, so this is kind of the culture. It's a very family-oriented culture. I love it. But this is actually cause a lot of issues. It's actually, if you look at a particular travel, for example, wedding, the public transport, and if you actually go to grocery shopping, and even you buying some medicine, if they're wearing the mask, but it seems that the social distance seems doesn't work. So this is the most important part of the thing is actually human mobility, where they visit, okay? Then why they actually travel, okay? Can we actually lock down? It's probably virtually impossible lock down everyone because they need food, basically go to the grocery. But there it seems social distancing doesn't work. This is a number of papers actually raised this issue before this Indian COVID, peaked early this year. So we actually noticed last year that there is a lot of interesting patterns. So Indian government preventive policies, then phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, that's more like a worldwide lockdown. In India is not an exception. They do that, this lockdown policy. Then they lose, and those lockdown policies, kind of gradually release policy. And you can see that different regions in India, you see that the number of incidents is actually increased over time. This is a 2020 last year figure. Then we actually looking at those mobility data. The tricky part is that because we can't access this travel data because it's virtually impossible to visit India and conduct a survey during amid of COVID. So there is any actually mobility data, open source data is available. There is 2 open source data, which is have a kind of limitation, but this is the most possible data we could possibly access during that time, which is a Google community mobility data and Apple mobility trend data. This is aggregate data. They're actually basically looking at people's aggregate number of people's mobility, which is they actually move particular area. And they're looking at what sort of facilities are. There are shopping centers, there is restaurants, because Google has this point data together with aggregate mobilities. So this is a kind of data is actually provide, it's sort of, the very rough idea why people actually move. So what are the major regions? It's pretty much 5 major regions. This data is identified, which is job-related mobility, which is commute, pretty much is commuting, and they're visiting kind of a grocery and pharmacy types of, daily needs, and they might visit the park, recreation, that types of mobilities, and also they actually visit I think that there's 5 categories here. Yes, transit centers. So there's grocery, retail, workplaces, park, transit center. That is the Google Community Mobility data actually provide these 5 areas. And there is some studies actually looking at the correlation between these mobility types and coronavirus incident. If you see that there is some scholars use Apple mobility data, some Google community data, but there is non-studies about India. There's many US and the UK case studies. So we get this data daily COVID incident, and the people actually visit particular location and particular mobility types. These 5 mobility type, broad mobility type. Then actually we applied the longitudinal data analysis, because the existing study, we look at the all existing literature using the Google Community Mobility data. They simply looking at the correlations, this number of mobilities and the number of COVID incident. And they might apply this kind of 14 days kind of incubation time. Okay? That's what they actually lack the model they applied, but they haven't really try to understand the longitudinal kind of relationship, because if it's a COVID incidence is increased, are their mobilities also increased? If mobility is actually increased, so they haven't really do the model whether this increase is associated with decrease or increase incident. Right? Not just the number of coins, particularly number of coins, number of incident and number of mobilities. So that model we actually use here, and the model is called Poisson log linear model. We use generalized estimation equation. So that is a very common model if we actually deal with count data as a dependent variable. So we know the number of count per day. Then this is kind of most popular model, and generalized estimation equation, which is it's kind of the matrix is we looking at one particular types of mobility. If this mobility is actually increased, and whether it's associated with the daily incident. So there is increase or decrease daily incident every day is as a matrix. So T1, day 2, day 3, day 4. Are there have any kind of relationship over time? So this is a big matrix because we've done about 6 months period, every day, single days, and whether this day 1 is associated with day 2, day 2 might associate with day 3. And also this is controlled by mobility types. So this is a kind of a log model. So we are looking at the probability. So the model research is actually showing here. So I just keep time constraint. I just key findings here. Basically, we read exponential beta coefficient, which is basically show the probability higher than 1 if its mobility is increased. Particular mobility type is increased, corona incident is actually increased. We use the 7 days lag model. So we compared mobility 7 days ago, the number of mobility increased or decreased 7 days ago and 7 days later, and what is coronavirus incident, we found that. And we also applied the 17 days. So 7 days and 17 days lag model we applied, but I just want to talk about 7 days. And it's very interesting finding, which is retail and recreation and grocery pharmacy positively correlate, which is the increase of visiting retail and recreation and grocery, which is likely increase that coronavirus incident. And this is statistically significant. It's pretty much 0.001 level, which is 99% confidence. So, but it's interesting, those people actually visit the parks and train station and workplaces, which is statistically not significant. So it's maybe related, it's maybe not related. It's not clear patterns on that. So this is a kind of suggest that Indian government policy, where is a hot spot they should restrict, okay? So which is, they often visit this grocery, it's an informal market, we see these borders, and their social distance is very hard to keep. And it's not like a shopping center. If you visit in India, there is very much open spaces, grocery, and also it's very crowded. And this is also an area which is the most vulnerable area in a hotspot which might be need of further preventive policy rather than those who visit the public parks and the workplace, which is a relatively have I think is robust policy might apply. So I don't know the story behind, but this is a statistical analysis actually found that these two mobilities is statistically significant, and it does positively affect coronavirus incident, and retail is higher than grocery and pharmacy. And if you look at 14 days lagged mobility indicator, 14 days, and the result is actually consistent. So if you see that the result and recreation, and the grocery and pharmacy, they are statistically significant, and these are two mobilities positively affect increasing coronavirus incidence. So 7 days and 14 days, we would assume that the 14 days is kind of incubation time, and this is proof that this is statistically significant positive correlations we actually identified in the model. So then we further studies, we looking at, we couldn't really get this micro scale level, but we looking at a number of grocery and pharmacy as this model indicated those important mobility affect coronavirus incident. And we see that there is huge increase, 2020 April and June, mobility is huge increase in those regions, grocery and pharmacy related trips. So this is kind of indicated that this corona incident is a further increase in the end of 2020 and early 2001. So that might have a very interesting policy. We could suggest that whether how we actually possibly help those poor people or low income people, they actually daily buying of grocery and food. Is the government could provide some sort of food ad or delivery system or delivery service. There is a lot of policy measure we could discuss, but this study is actually focused on this the correlations between mobility patterns and coronavirus incident. So yeah, there's obviously the further policy implication and discussion we needed. And this is quite simple and straightforward analysis and proof of what are the most important mobility patterns and or what are the area which is higher increase in those high risk mobilities. So that is kind of research finding, and we could further analysis this most recent data, which is 2021 up to now. So that is another paper we are going on. That's our reference, and this paper is 2 months ago. It's accepted. Geographical research is Q1 journal. So yeah, that's it. Right, if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Hoon. That was like very interesting. That like retail and leisure kind of like recreational stuff like fuels, COVID explosion. That's kind of hard to think about. Like basically, I would have thought like more of a workplace thing, but surprising to see like retail and leisure feels it more. So we have like 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So we'll start with people online first, and then move to people who are here. So anybody with a question online, like go ahead. You can either pop it on the chat or you can raise your hand and go ahead. So while people are thinking about this, so basically my question would be, is this have you looked at the correlations at state level? So because a lot of regulations in India happens at state level, and there might be changes within that. So I guess that's yeah.
Yeah. So I assume that we probably need dozens of descriptive analysis before we conduct this model. The reason we use the longitudinal data analysis, which is we actually looking at each region, regional level, whether this the mobilities correlate with the coronavirus incident, each regions. Okay, then we looking at each region, they are actually has a pattern. So that the result, which is including every single region and their performance over time, okay, then is a kind of grand model, which is to show whether they are enough to convince people, statistically significant, we can say this mobility is actually highly correlate with the incident. So that is a model approach. Yes, it does include,
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. So any questions from people who are here? Yeah, how?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning, so you may have explained this, but what was the thinking about the choice of India as your site? Is the accuracy of the incidence data good enough there? Or, sorry if you explained that at the beginning anyway.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's the reviewer's comment is actually most difficult part to answer because it's data.
Reviewer.
Yeah, data reliability. So it's basically this data. Yes, it's true. Those who doesn't have a mobile phone, okay, they probably won't be capturing this data. So that might be exclude very poor people, right? So that is the data limitation. And also,
but not so much on the mobility side, more on the incidence of coronavirus. That's what I'm thinking of. That's where I'm questioning the how much under-reporting there might be.
Well, that's another data limitation. The daily COVID incident is collected by Indian government in provincial level. This is official data. Probably Sabaswa might know how they actually collected this data, but that is we'll probably see the is most reliable data within the India. But that is related to the number of tests they conducted, exactly. And the number of the sample they actually collected. So this has a limitation. At the beginning of this presentation, I also mentioned that. Well, these two mobility data, which is pretty much is the most reliable data at this stage because it's virtually impossible to travel in India, conduct a survey, and collect this mobility data at this national scale. So, so we need to interpret this result, yes, conservatively, yes.
I can add that. So basically, like my experience, it may vary different to different states in terms of underreporting and like how much is being reported. But in my experience, the reporting is fairly accurate because it happens at primary health center level. So whenever there is a test which has been done and like it turns positive, so it's been sent directly to the district collectorate level. So those organizations work like what you get out of that data is like very accurate. Might be different in certain states and certain regions, but overall it should be a good proxy, like within a percentage. It should not be completely different from what's on ground. So that's my experience.
Is there any text, I think?
So there's a question about like any studies on Melbourne or Victoria, the same.
No, I haven't seen any paper use this data in Australia, so that is possible. This is data available pretty much every country.
Yeah,
and I certainly see UK and US and China. There are three countries that publish it. So yes, there is Yeah.
And another comment we have is it's particularly its type of retail is also like kind of significant in there because in certain states like Tamil Nadu especially, liquor stores and when they open, so it's fully organized by state government.
Yeah.
Liquor stores and liquor distribution, and whenever that opens, like that might be like a huge correlation between like when the liquor stores open, retail, and
Yeah.
so that's that.
So when I studied this data, then I really hope they might provide a breakdown sort of the information. Let's say the retail. I really like to know whether this is sort of a cafeteria types or is sort of convenience store and what you say this. But this Google is provide this very sort of broad category, so that is also limitation as well. Yeah.
Are places of worship included in the categories at all? Because the second half of certainly early this year, there's been major festivals and places of worship have also emerged as hotspots in India.
Yeah. So they included those, the temples in the sort of recreational area, but they haven't actually identified those worship places like outdoor, like you have a river, there are a lot of people goes to, and the mountains they wouldn't specify that. Yeah.
That might be explained retail and leisure being like more significant.
Yeah. One of the interesting thing I found that this social distance is in India, those culture is very hard to retain. Is just imagine you just any queue in coffee shop. Without social distance, before COVID, we have maybe 1 meter's distance each other, but it seems the culture is very sort of close to. And when they talk like that.
That's not true everywhere. So basically, like,
perhaps COVID will restructure
like my
that.
state, I think like the culture is in itself socially distanced. Like you do not like be close, shake hands, hugging and all like completely off.
Exactly.
And you're supposed to wash your hands before you come to inside your house. So it depends on where it is. Like it's.
But I noticed that it's not to the India is like that. That
depends on where you're
yes,
from as well.
and it's opposite. That no.
And so basically, there is another comment as well. So this could be very significant. In terms of states, there was a state level elections that happened before the second wave. So there might be significant changes because of election rallies and like election based stuff. So if you pick out like the states which had elections, like that might be different from the ones which didn't have elections. Yeah. So that could be the another one which we can see.
Okay.
I think I saw last year during the lockdowns some media just having the raw Google data of Australia. So maybe in news you might be able to find that for Australia, but again, not with the analysis.
Okay, I think that concludes the first part of our seminar today. And thank you very much, Hoon. That was very interesting. I'm looking forward to reading it, the full paper. So I hope it's like in a couple of months, I guess.
Yeah, so we got minor revision, so lucky, so I done it, so we publish it probably very soon. Yeah.
Cool, looking forward. Thanks. For next speaker, we have Rupa. Rupa is a PhD student from UNSW as well. And so she's going to talk about the apartment boom in Sydney and like topics related to that. So yeah, so being from Valley Australia project, I'm very interested to hear what she has. So I'll just set up the presentation for you.
That's it.
Cool. So people should be able to see the screen as well. It's shared, so they should be.
Oh, okay, great.
You can,
I want to block the screen.
you can use the clicker for.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yes, yeah. That should work. That's right. Does it
Okay,
work?
thank you. Yeah.
Ah, that's good.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for attending. Friday before a long weekend. I'll try to make it short and snappy. So the results that I'll be presenting today are part of a PhD thesis. I'm 7 months away from submitting, hopefully. And today's presentation is on a specific aspect of the research thesis, identifying the key sales intermediary groups that were responsible for Sydney's last apartment boom. I structured the presentation in 4 sections. Firstly, quickly setting the research context, and going through the research approach, some of the key findings and the implications of the research. So context, it won't come as a surprise to everyone that Sydney, along with a lot of the other Australia's capital cities, has seen a massive increase in apartment construction, and I'll refer to apartments interchangeably with strata property or multi-unit dwellings. This slide demonstrates that significant peak we saw in construction in 2018. The dotted orange line refers to planning approvals of multi-unit dwellings, and the solid line refers to actual completions. And in 2018, when that peak in completions of apartments occurred, the level of completions was 3 times that of detached housing. It was a historical high level of completions, and the focus of this research is really investigating, the sales processes behind that development peak. We've also known through, well publicised in the media that there are some problems that have emerged in the apartment market. It began with structural defects issues in recently completed buildings in Sydney. But in parallel, another issue that's been identified in international literature is ethics and low levels of professionalism in the real estate sales industry. But there doesn't seem to be a connection between the 2 trends. The other literature in relation to problems that have emerged in the apartment sector has suggested that the recent wave of development has been too focused on targeting the investor market, which has compromised the quality of buildings completed. So based on this context, I think the sales process is worthy of attention, which is the focus of my thesis. There's a couple of key themes that have emerged in the literature that relate to the presentation today. First is the practice of project marketing, and the role of project marketers has evolved over time. So project marketing is a practice that has been around in Australia since the 1970s, when high-profile apartment projects were completed in capital city locations, including the Gold Coast, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Project marketing is a practice that's unique in that word marketing is attached. So sales agents work very closely with advertising companies and marketing companies and digital media companies to create a vision or a concept of a potential dwelling in the absence of a physically completed one. So there are multiple actors in that marketing and sales process. It's also a niche area because there are few companies that have expertise in providing the service. So the Real Estate Institute of New South Wales has a 2,000 member organisation database, and in that database, less than 10% of companies have indicated that they have project marketing expertise. Technology is playing a big part in disrupting the role of real estate agents in the sale process, and COVID has escalated that process even more. So some examples of how that's occurring is that there are digital aggregators that have emerged that collect and qualify via leads and inquiries and on-sell that information to developers and real estate agents. Now that role was traditionally fulfilled by real estate agents. Another way is the way agents and buyers communicate with each other or developers. There are technological apps like WeChat that engage Chinese buyer audience and business audience. During COVID, inspections became online, and based on the interviewees and secondary data information that I've read, that sort of has restructured the sales process going beyond COVID. Now, between 2010 and 2020, there was a 160% increase in the number of licensed real estate corporations in New South Wales. There's been an enormous growth in real estate agencies in the state, and agencies supposedly providing project marketing services. So there's greater market competition, and along with the technological disruption of the sector, sales commissions have been falling, and sales commissions are unregulated in Australia. A recent report by Macquarie Bank highlighted how lucrative new housing development is for the real estate agency industry. The sale of development sites, off-the-plan sales, on sales or resales of completed property provide sales commissions revenue, which tends to be more volatile. But the more stable revenue stream for the industry is managing property on behalf of investor purchasers. So it produces long-term financial benefits. And the idea of this research is to highlight how those sales practices indicate that there are mutual interests between the development and the sales industry in stimulating or encouraging apartment development. The other key theme that has emerged is risks in the apartment production and sales process. Given the large volume of some projects and the lengthy timeframes of completion, there's the presence of the market changing, market demand shifting, and negatively affecting sales proceeding, which then creates the issue of settlement risk, those sales contracts falling over if the market cycle turns, as has been evident in a lot of the cities in Australia. The other issue highlighted in the literature internationally is principal-agent relations, or risks in principal-agent relations. The most common relations in the literature are between the buyer and the seller, or the buyer and the agent, but there seems to be little attention paid to the relationship between the developer and the real estate agent. And the risks emerge when there's a divergence in the financial goals and risk appetite of the two parties in that relation, which might lead to improper conduct and poor sales practices. It might lead to misleading information provided to developed by an agent, or an inflation in the level of effort or costs that they quote to a developer when in actual reality that's not the case. So in a nutshell, those relational risks produce inferior sales outcomes and potentially not the right product to the market that's available to purchase. So the research gaps that I've identified particularly, focus on limited knowledge of how the sales occur, who's involved in the sales process, the complexity of the process, and the nature of relations between the sales parties. So I use an agency structure theoretical lens to investigate the sales process. And the diagram, this three concentric circle.
I think the sharing is not working very well. I'm just trying to get this.
So the three concentric circle diagram pretty much shows the application of institutional theory, and institutional theory has been applied across different sub-disciplines in economics and sociology and geography, and I'm blending institutional theory and urban managerialism. So institutional theory, who are institutions? I argue in this research that financial institutions and government institutions set the rules of the sales game. They create the rules that agents have to abide by when playing the sales game, and the goal is to make as many sales as possible, as quickly as possible. So they're the outside concentric circle. The middle circle refers to the sales industry landscape. Who are all the players in the sales game? And then right in the middle is actually the real estate agents, the key market actors in this housing market process. So I'm suggesting that theoretical lens is useful in investigating the sales process, and understanding who sells, how they sell, why they sell, can explain what is actually built. Here's the research aim, as I've mentioned, sales process, key market actors in a specific housing market process. It's aligned to 3 research objectives. I'll be focusing on the second one. Each of the objectives have in parallel research questions, and the key question that I'm interested in talking about today is who are the sales intermediaries and how has that sales industry structure evolved? So I've used a mixed methods research design. My primary data source is semi-structured interviews with 36 senior professionals in the industry that were directly involved in selling themselves or managing the sales of apartment projects in that supply peak period. I've also ensured there's a variety of professionals who have had experience in selling apartments but other housing types, and also across different geographies in Australia, including Sydney. The interview data is supplemented by some customised data that was purchased from CoreLogic on apartment supply over that period by the sales company that was associated with that apartment supply, and I've done some desktop analysis to identify the types of key characteristics of those companies. Going to the key findings. So the interviews were transcribed and coded and analysed using NVivo. And that process highlighted these key sales intermediary groups. And I'll focus on the 3 largest ones. Feel free to ask any questions about the other 2. So channel sales companies, developers with in-house sales teams, and large project marketing firms. So turning first to channel sales companies, the diagram tries to illustrate who are these channel sales groups and networks. They basically include real estate agencies, but also their networks with accountants, investment advisors, mortgage brokers, financial planners, and digital aggregators, those lead generators I talked about previously. Now, investment advisors, financial planners, and mortgage brokers were very much the subject of the Banking Royal Commission, and their ethics and commissions and I suppose practices were questioned. And it just highlights the linkages between property and financial institutions and the sale of apartments as well. So the types of themes that emerge in the interviews are that channel sales companies are useful in generating large volumes of sales, particularly to investors and agent buyer groups who had grown substantially in Sydney in the last decade through high levels of immigration, but also foreign investment into the residential real estate sector. They enabled a developer to cast a wide net beyond the immediate area of the project, so generate interstate and international sales. And they were useful in generating sales, not just in market booms, but when the market turned, like it did during the COVID period. It was difficult to facilitate sales. They generally signed open agency agreements. Developers were not willing to commit to a particular channel sales company. So there was lack of loyalty between the 2 parties in that agreement. And an agent was paid a commission as and when they brought a sale to a developer or a real estate agent. And they almost were described as a buyer's agent, bringing buyers to developers or the main agency appointed. They typically charged high sell commissions, and there was referral to some of that commission rebated back to buyers to entice the buyers to commit to a sale, particularly through that channel sales company. And they've become more prevalent in the last decade post GFC. So the channel sales groups were sort of described as a B2B sales model, a wholesale sales model, and larger project marketing companies, which I'll talk to, are more a B2C sales model. So the channel sales firms were basically an additional layer of businesses that emerged between the developer and the consumer. And it was just demonstrated the fragmentation and greater competition in the industry. This wholesale retail model is common amongst sales of clothes or furniture and other products, but it seemed that the trading of apartments was also adopting this wholesale retail sales approach. The other large group was project marketing companies, and they were described as the big guys, the big machines, multinational companies, specialist project providers. And this group have been involved in off-the-plan apartment sales since its advent in the 1970s. As I mentioned before, a B2C model, they were the face in front of the customer. They offered a wide breadth of services. They were well staffed to be able to do elaborate sales pitches, and with the agency appointments, they were able to rotate staff through multiple projects. And developers and financiers, more importantly, assumed that they were a less risky group. They were a big trusted brand. They had a established track record, established reputation. All these factors had become particularly important post-defects. They were assumed to be successful in reaching the high pre-sale rates, but to demonstrate how competitive the industry is, each sales intermediary group tried to inflate the ability of their own group over their competitor groups. And there was commentary around this group being the 60%ers. They would achieve the pre-sale rates that were required, and then once the pressure was off, they would be more relaxed in their effort levels, and the sales were outsourced to other sales intermediary groups. It was not clear whether this was, well known to the developer who had appointed these large sales agencies. They also preferred to be exclusively appointed over a certain term. So their sales commissions were guaranteed over that term, and they may even have received sales commissions irrespective of whether they had actually executed that sale themselves. And the developer or a competitor agency may have negotiated that sale. The third group, the in-house developers with in-house sales teams, and it was certainly more common among the large developers, not so common amongst the small and mid-tier developers. And the advantages that the developers and other participants mentioned was that they had the ability to train the internal, external staff, better monitor the staff, ensure that there was a consistent sales message in the sales process. They also had built up market knowledge through their extensive development experience. They had their own buyer databases, particularly repeat buyer databases. They had their own business networks. They also had a wide breadth of internal services. Some of them were able to help buyers with mortgage financing. They were able to manage properties for investor purchases. They had internal design teams, architect teams, building and project management teams. So they didn't really need the breadth of services from external sales agencies. They had a better understanding of projects if they had a project management arm internally, and for some it was cost effective if they had an integrated model. However, a consistent message from most interviewees was that they require external real estate agents to sell, particularly if they were doing large volume projects. There's just no way that a developer can make all the same sales themselves. Interestingly, almost all interviewees mentioned that in the planning approval process, developers try to maximise the yield on the site and get as many apartments as possible on the site. So it was interesting that there was limited connection between that initial phase of getting as much stock on the site when buying the site or during the planning approval processes, and the consequences that might emerge as projects become large in the complexity of the sales process and the costs that it might involve in marketing and selling projects. So the use of multiple sales groups was a consistent message. Project marketing was described as a team sport, required many hands on deck, multiple types of agents, and of course the developer was paying for all these agents to sell along the way, along with the advertising and marketing costs, which then eventually has an implication on profit margins and the final sell price that a purchaser pays. Turning to the core logic data, there was some consistencies between the two data sets. So the sample included 6 companies, over 500 projects, over 30,000 dwellings built over that 2017 to 2019 period. But for the sake of investigating the company profiles and the characteristics of each group, I had to choose projects that were only associated with one single company. But as I've just mentioned, there are multiple sales companies that sell a project. So as a result, the data didn't show up channel sales groups as making a big contribution to apartment supply, but it certainly showed the large project marketing firms and franchises made up a small proportion of the sample of companies, but they made, over a 60% contribution to the quantum of apartments that were built in the boom period and the value of projects. The big guys, the big machines. Franchises were often likened to the large project marketing companies because they had an established brand, large networks, and the ability to manage property after their purchases on behalf of investor purchases. When looking at the characteristics of the types of intermediary groups, again, the large project marketing firms and franchises, they had a global coverage, were able to sell development sites, then pick up a project marketing, and franchises particularly were then able to offer, the resales and property management services as well. So all the groups had at least 3 types of services they were able to offer, which, was on the back of apartment development. And the big guys, the larger groups, were more established businesses compared to channel sales agencies or some smaller independent agencies. This, again, evidence of, that sort of linkage to apartment development providing long-term business opportunities was that majority of the sales companies were involved in selling development sites, project marketing, managing the property, and, generating sales revenue through resales. So what are the implications of this research? Well, the wholesale retail model and the multiple references, of apartments as products by many of the interviews suggest that it's certainly become a housing investment commodity. And the larger and more complex projects get, the greater the requirement for many types of sales companies, which demonstrates the multiple principal agent relations just in one housing market process and the scope for relational risks. The greater the pressure to achieve pre-sales, that pressure placed by perhaps, banking financial institutions, post-Royal Commission, then has implications on who's actually engaged to sell. The risk of information asymmetry, one party having more information than the other in the sales process, the high levels of competition can then potentially lead to questionable sales practices. Have implications for the quality of sales services provided to buyers, and the highly competitive sales environment and the discrepancy in sales commissions between intermediary groups may then diminish the long-term interests of an agent in, beyond that immediate sale to a purchaser. Existing body of literature has shown, that despite the increase in housing supply enabled through high-density housing, there's still inequitable wealth accumulation, housing affordability issues. There have been patterns of socio-spatial disadvantage in Sydney as well, and one has to wonder whether these sales practices, are enhancing those patterns that are present in the literature. That's it from me. References.
That was perfect. We still have time for more questions, and we'll go from online first, and then we'll see where. Let's see, chat's open. Yeah, cool. So if you have any question, you can ask away, or please type in the chat. Okay. In the meanwhile, anyone here have any questions?
Could you say a little bit more about the racial steering and the implications?
Oh yes, I didn't talk about that. Yes, yes, certainly international literature talks about pointing certain cultural subgroups to certain types of housing, but also geographic location of that housing, and it links into your work previously about the culturally diverse population now in strata communities. So certainly channel sales being deliberately used to sell projects to Indonesian, Vietnamese, Filipino, Indian, Chinese communities, irrespective of whether they're investor or owner occupiers, seems to suggest that there is that racial steering practice occurring.
That's really interesting.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Rupa, how much do you think, this is a very specifically Australian story, apartment development is global, but I don't know whether this story that you're picking out here, can be generalized beyond.
It's very global. In fact, these trends that we're seeing here are evident in Canada, the US, Europe, any global city around the world that has a brand and is branded, a global city is going through same sorts of trends. And again, technology has reduced that distance, geographic distance between metropolitan cities as well.
And yet there hasn't been very much other work done that focuses on this relationship that you're covering.
Yes, there's that paper that's coming about in housing studies, but that doesn't focus on new apartments, but the sales practices of real estate agents. So there's lots of future scope to do more research in this area.
What is it? What long-term interests are there? You said some of them do have management interests and that kind of thing. How common is that, and are there other forms of long-term interests? And are there conflicts of interest in that? I think developers in New South Wales aren't allowed to manage or.
Not that I'm aware of. I think certainly something that's been very interesting that's come about is that the larger project marketing firms, when selling development sites, they strong arm the developers who are looking to buy the site, and tell them you'll only get the site if you sign us on as project marketing. That's working in the industry. I know that happens, and I've heard it happens, but it's actually been vocalized in these interviewees in the interview. So there's certainly conflicts of interest, and there's supposed to be Chinese walls between departments. As to whether that's monitored very well or not really. And property management, that Macquarie Bank report, it was a high-level report, but just showed that the huge growth in property management divisions, and almost every company that I surveyed using the CoreLogic data had a property management arm. As to whether it was a large and established business, it was certainly on their websites indicated that they had that ability to manage property. And again, the people whose properties they manage may subsequently buy property in the future. So it's in their interest to retain those clients, whether it's through their sales division or property management division.
Yeah, I'm interested in, is it a specific time period you are focused on? Or?
I focused on the 2017 to 2019 period, but because the interviews took place during COVID, the market was starting to turn. And many interviews likened the COVID period to the GFC period. And subsequent to that, it seems that there's another, cycle emerging with government providing stimulus to the, housing market, and potentially we're at the start of another cycle. So perhaps down the track, the same research can be replicated. As to whether we're going to see a repeat in that massive apartment boom, I doubt it. I think we've learned a lesson. A lot of the interviews and secondary data seems to suggest that the buyer profile has also shifted. So the focus of agents is very much now on owner-occupiers. The planning approvals of multi-unit dwelling projects are now shifting to more smaller scale projects as well. So yeah, it has long-term implications. Certainly this same thing can be replicated to the other states, because the Real Estate Institute of Australia has tried to make it a nationally accredited profession, but or it was termed NOLA, but it's been knocked back by the federal government. So the licensing system, which allows real estate agents to sell, is totally different in every state. The commission structure is different across each state. So there's no standard rules or regulations that relate to the sales industry, which then creates, competition between states. And
Cool. Thank you very much, Rupa. That was very